Good morning. As we're gathering together, let me just ask if you can hear well. Kim in the back, can we hear mostly? Okay. We've had some spotty audio problems, so hopefully you can hear me. If you're in a place where it's dropping out, sometimes if you move around in the pews, you can hear a little better. So we're working on it, but when all the walls are concave, it's a little difficult. So, well, let me get us going. I'm Jeremy. I'm pastor here at Circular. I'm really glad that we're all here together, and just wanted to say a very brief word of introduction about my friend, Amy Butler, our friend. Some of you know she was last with us virtually as our guest lecturer in the fall of 2020. Everything was on Zoom, and we said at that time, gosh, we hope we could be together in person one day. And so we're really happy that the day has come. Just briefly, if you don't know Amy, you can read more about her bio at pastoramy.com. But Amy is a real path breaker, I did want you to know. Those of us who grew up in the Baptist tradition know that fighting for women's ordination has been a lifelong struggle, and Amy, coming up in that tradition, was the first woman ever to serve as the senior minister of the Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. And then also the first woman to serve as the senior pastor of the historic Riverside Church in the city of New York. And is currently senior pastor, I want to say this is even better than Riverside, at the Community Church, which is a UCC church in Honolulu. So she's traveled a long way to be with us and has a wonderful book from which to share. And so with that, Amy, we're really glad you're here. And could I welcome you to teach us? Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm so nervous. I'm just going to say that right now, because you're like the first ever people I'm talking to about this book. It comes out October 3rd, and it's like my whole life spilled across pages, and I'm terrified. And this seems to be the right place to do it, because my friend Jeremy has asked me for years, so when's the book coming out? When's the book coming out? So I thought I would just tell you a little bit about myself and about the book and the process of writing the book, and then read just a little bit from it, and then maybe we could have some conversation. So a few weeks ago, so Random House is printing this book, which is surreal to me. And so there's a marketing team, and they're all like 23 years old. And they're like, so what is the point of this book? And you're a what? And who's gonna buy this book, you know? And how do we market it? And so they said to me, just tell us, like, what is the point of your book? What is the point of your book? This is the question I've been asking myself for many years. What is the point of your book? Because, like, who's gonna wanna sit and read, like, I was born, and then, you know, like, come on. So I think what I said to those 21 or 23-year-olds was, the book is about being brave. It's about being brave enough to tell your story and your truth as a way of making a path back to relationship with somebody who's different than you are. And this book happened to be born in a time in our country when we have a really, really difficult time having Thanksgiving dinner together. But what a lot of people don't know is that that's the essence of what being a pastor is. It's like finding ways to build bridges between people who have like principal differences between themselves, and most especially ourselves. You might not know this, but when the preacher's up there preaching, she is preaching to herself, if she's good. And so that's what the book is about. The book is about me sort of telling stories about relationships in my life that have changed me. And they are relationships that have been beautiful and relationships that have been really, really, really painful and broken. They're about relationships with institutions that have let me down. They're about times when I've let people down myself. And it's about how I've learned to be a human in the world this far. Nobody told me it was going to be this hard, and I'm kind of mad about that. That and also breastfeeding, so it really, really hard. And don't let anybody tell you it's just something natural, right? So this is a book about essays that have changed me, and I titled it after the Frederick Buechner quote, which all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. You know, here is the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen, don't be afraid. And that sort of makes me feel teary, but that's how I'm trying to live in this messy human world in which we live. Now, about writing a book, it sucks. It's terrible. It's terrible. I hate it. I hated every minute of it. I just want to tell you, it's like pouring your guts out and your editor saying like, that's a little harsh, or I don't think that's the point of what you're trying to say here. Or so I wrote this book 4 times, and it took a total of 6 years. And the reason I wrote it 4 times is they said at first, we just want a book of essays like your blogs, okay? So I give them a book of essays, and they're like, no, like people aren't gonna really appreciate it until they know your whole story. So let's, like, I was born, and then like, which is not an interesting story, really. I mean, you know, and then Donald Trump got elected, and then I got fired from Riverside Church in a very public way, and then like this beautiful and terrible things happened. I started a nonprofit called Invested Faith, and so the shape of the book has changed many, many times, and I had to read it for audio recording a few weeks ago, and it was my first time really reading the whole thing. But I tell you, for 6 years I've been like, my life is boring the heck out of me. Like, I do not want to read about myself anymore, or even write. It was so hard. How many of you have written a book? Okay, right? Right? It's the worst. Anyway, so a few weeks ago, I got the galleys in a box. The publisher sent me the galleys, and I opened it up, and I saw this beautiful cover, and I was like, send it back. I don't want anybody to read it. I'm scared. And so this is how I come to you this morning, really scared. So in this book, I write a lot about my faith and the transformation of my faith, particularly as it relates to the institution of the church and the many, many ways in which I have found life in this institution, and also a lot of pain and a lot of hurt and a lot of death, actually. I write about being a woman, what it's like to be a woman in a profession that is dominated mostly by white men. And I write a lot about the mistakes that I have made over these 30 years of being a pastor and being a person in the world. When you read this book, you'll read about my divorce. You'll read about the time I got fired. You will read about the death of a child. You will read about a lot of really, really painful things, and you will meet some of the most amazing people who have changed my life. So I want to say a word about the cover before I read just a little part from chapter 6. I was telling Jeremy, the people at Random House were like, it has to be botanical, because that's what women like, botanical. And that's your audience, like women, right? So I'm like, well, I'm Native Hawaiian. I grew up in Hawaii. I live there now. I can't just have any kind of botanical on the front of my book. Like in Hawaii, flowers are like very sacred and they mean different things. And I said, I have to have this special flower. It's called an ohia lehua, and it is the first flower that blooms after a lava flow. So when the lava flows and creates new land, thank you. This is the first flower that comes up, and it's like this very wiry shrub, kind of. It's not very attractive. And then like these beautiful red flowers burst out of this plant. And to me, it is a symbol of what being human is like in the world, you know? Really terrible and also really beautiful. And so that's why the ohia lehua is on the front. And I told Jeremy they kept sending me hibiscuses. And I was like, you guys, there's Google. So it was a back and a forth. And currently, for those of you who keep up with Hawaiian news, we're going through a devastating time with the fires on Maui. We also have a devastating like fungus that is destroying most of the ohia lehua on the islands. And so that's become a big matter of news for those of us who live there, because the flower is so sacred and it has such meaning. So I'm reading a short part of the book today. It's from chapter 6, especially for you guys, because we're sitting in a church. In this chapter, well, the chapter is titled Mom, I'm an Atheist, and it's about my son Hayden, and about what it's like maybe to be a pastor's kid, and how I thought about nurturing the faith life of my children, and how that turned out. So here's the part of the chapter. A few years later, my son Hayden stood at the front of the congregation as a high school graduate, receiving a laundry basket filled with granola bars and laundry detergent and other college dorm necessities. At church, we have the tradition of blessing our seniors and sending them off into the wide world, and with that blessing, off he went to his first semester of college. And after his first semester of college, my newly minted adult arrived home for the holiday at Christmas. We did the laundry. We got caught up on the roommate situation. We sat at the table together laughing. And one night we were up late talking, and Hayden said, you know, Mom, I think I need to tell you that I'm an atheist. I could tell he was worried about his revelation as he hurried to explain, see, I took this philosophy class, and I've been thinking a lot about the logic of believing in God. It just doesn't really make any sense to me. And anyway, even though there are some nice people at church, even people I love, I think that most people who go to church are hypocrites. They say they believe in God, but they treat each other like shit. It doesn't make any sense to me. Sorry for swearing. That's like the one place in the book that I swear. I recalled my own liberating experience of college, of being pretty sure with one semester of college under my belt that I was an expert at many, if not all, things. As long as you're asking the questions, I repeated my mantra to Hayden, that's all I want to know. I think I took Hayden's announcement fairly well. That is, until Christmas Eve. We were getting ready to head out to church, to Christmas Eve service, and I noticed Hayden sitting on the couch watching a movie. Are you going to be ready to go in a few minutes? I asked. You know, I have to be early to make sure all the kids in the nativity are lined up and ready to go. I don't think I'm going to come this year, Mom, he said. Remember, I'm an atheist. So I don't think there's any point in going to church even on Christmas Eve. And my heart sank. But we go together every year, Hayden. Felt like only 5 minutes ago that Hayden himself was one of the kids in the nativity, decked out in an old bathrobe and balancing a Burger King crown on his head. But that night, no matter how much I tried to appeal to his sense of nostalgia, I couldn't get him to change his mind. I don't believe in God anymore, he said. There's no place at church for me. As the two younger kids and I drove to church that night, I silently reminded myself that all I wanted to do was raise kids who kept asking the questions. But that night, it didn't seem enough. Christmas Eve without Hayden seemed like such a loss, atheist or not. I wanted him to know there was room in church for people like him, just as there was room for people who believed in God with no hesitation, and for those of us who struggle with believing constantly. After all, we're all one of those people at one time or another. Of all the places in the world that might bring people with questions together, surely it should be the church? As the worship service got underway, we sang favorite hymns, and we heard the story of a baby and a whole bunch of angels and some shepherds and wise men who followed a star. Kids and grown-ups in a regal procession tripped over their costumes as they made their way down the aisle to take their places in the nativity tableau. And at the end of the service, as we do every year, we lit candles and sang the hymn silently. I was always terrified to do this in our 1886 sanctuary. I don't know if you are too. Like someone's going to drop a candle and there's going to be a fire and it's going to go down in the history. Yeah, that's not in the book. As the sanctuary lights dimmed, I looked out over faces of the congregation, so many people I loved so dearly, some who had captured my heart the first time I met them, some whose respect was earned at the side of a hospital bed or on the soft grass of a cemetery, and some who I had to relearn to tolerate every day, very often failing. I really loved them, I realized. This ragtag community that for me symbolized so much pain and refuge and hope. And as we continued to sing, I scanned the gathered crowd, thinking about our collective warmth and our sense of welcome. And I noticed out of the corner of my eye, up in the balcony, standing next to his brother and sister, my stalwartly atheist college student, bringing with him all of his thoughtful, ethical doubts. He decided to come to church after all, and there he was, holding a candle and singing the words of the songs he's heard since childhood. The crowd raised our voices together. Radiant beams from thy holy face, with the dawn of redeeming grace. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. And in that moment, all together, we were the best expression of human community. A messy, beautiful group of believers and doubters, and some people with no faith to speak of, learning again that the differences between us are so much smaller than we think. If we'll just move down a bit and make a little more space in the pew for people who we thought didn't belong there. Thank you. Clear. Thank you, all of you, for listening. I appreciate your attention, and I don't know how to do this, so here we are. I'd love to have some conversation with you about the book. Any questions you have or thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think we're going to bring the microphone for questions. Anyone who has one can raise your hand, and I can start. I've had a little time. Amy, I wonder if you could just share a little about, so many of us, our hearts have been in Hawaii the last few weeks, and maybe just a word about how it feels to you, how people are doing. We'd just love to hear from you how it is.
So here's how it went down. All of you have watched it on the news, but there was a hurricane off the south side of the islands that sent 70-mile-per-hour winds that blew some sparks in downtown Lahaina. And so they said, like, if you were standing in your house and you could see someplace on fire, within 30 seconds your house was completely engulfed in flames. So Lahaina, as many of you know who have been there, is out on a peninsula. And so they didn't want to raise the tsunami alarms because they thought people would run toward the water. But there's only one road in and one road out. So people were, in effect, stuck there. And that's the tragedy of it all. You know, people were jumping into the water, and like Lahaina is completely destroyed. And they still have not recovered the remains of everyone who died there. So I guess there are two things that come to mind immediately. The first is, I told Jeremy, it's lovely to be in a place with a tragedy where people know how to take care of each other. I write about this actually in the book a lot. When you live on an island, you learn to take care of each other. And maybe you guys probably feel some of this in Charleston too, because your thriving and my thriving are directly connected. So there's been an outpouring of love and care and so on. The other thing you should know is that the remains of these people will never be recovered. And there's a lot of discussion and dissension already about the native Hawaiian sacredness of the Aina, the land, and what this means, that this one of the biggest tourist spots in Hawaii has now become, in effect, a cemetery. And so how we move forward with that is going to be interesting. And I'm a religious leader in the islands, but I'm new to I've been gone for 30 years. So I've since sort of taken a step back and watched and seen what you would expect, as you have experienced in Charleston. After a tragedy happens, like, what do you say? Like, they don't teach us this in seminary. So there's a lot of trauma, and it's collectively felt, and we're just living through it right now. Thank you for asking.
I have a question, and this is maybe a hard one, so sorry.
That's okay.
You know, you mentioned your beautiful and terrible things that you've experienced. As a woman in leadership, how do you balance, when you're in those difficult times, authenticity with those with whom you are engaging, but also boundaries around your own experience and being honest that you're struggling, but also knowing that you're caring for others as well? How do you find a balance and all that? That's the easy, just give me one sentence and let me know what I need to do.
Oh, man, that's a hard question. So I have been first woman at every church that I've pastored, and so sort of making it up as I went along. And you will know that people, when you're the first, people step back and wait for you to fail until you don't, and then they want to be your best friend, which is so annoying. But I got some good advice early on from a friend who told me, like, really just be in the pulpit the same person that you are outside the pulpit, because it's too hard to maintain like this fake persona. And what happened to me was like, God was like, yeah, and then like yanked me into all these public things. Like, you can't hide a divorce, right? You can't hide your kid being an atheist. You can't hide, all the things that we try to hide. And so I just decided to go with it, just like be exactly who I was no matter what. Like, I will say bad words in church. And the woman who I did their wedding yesterday, she said, Pastor Amy, thank you so much for coming from Hawaii to do our wedding, but please don't cuss during the service. Yeah. So then, the part of my story that became very public. I was the first woman minister to be called as the pastor of Riverside Church in the city of New York. And that's a whole story in itself. But, I was in Time magazine, and I was on the front of the Washington Post, and everybody was digging for every single thing they could. And I just thought, I'm just going to go into this being exactly who I am and no apologies. And what happened to me? I got fired. So, there's a risk to that. And I followed this long tradition of pastors who were celebrities, who had this shiny persona up in that big pulpit. And The day they hired me, the chair of the board called me aside and said, we didn't want to tell you this before we hired you because we didn't think you would take the job, but we're going to be doing some work on the stained glass windows, and so we're going to close down the entire front of the nave, including the pulpit, for 18 months. So you're going to have to preach from the floor, which was the best way to start, right? Because when you're up in the big pulpit, it's easy to take shots, right? But when you're a real person, it's a little harder. That's the only way I survived 5 years. So that's my advice. It's not pretty. It hurts like hell. It's really hard. But I think it's harder to fake like you're someone you're not.
I'm just going by the hands I saw a minute ago.
Hey, I appreciate your honesty, even through adversity. My question is, I heard the words going through tragedy, loss of family. Did that cause you to run closer to your faith in God, or did that steer you off course a bit before you realigned?
Thank you for that question. You know, I lose my faith about 3 or 4 times in this book, just give you a teaser, because I don't think you're really living a human life if you don't lose your faith every once in a while. My divorce came at a time when the church had been through some very bad conflict, and I was done, like done. I confused in my head the institution of church and who God was, which I think is something a lot of us do. And church is terrible. I mean, church can be terrible. People are terrible. People are terrible to each other just in general. And so they are in church, right? And so for, I would say, 2 years, I was getting up in the pulpit and preaching, and I didn't believe anything I was saying. And I have a friend who's told me, don't say that in public. But it was the truth. And I have a group of colleagues, they're called my preacher camp friends, one of whom will be here today, and they just said to me, look, we'll hold your faith for you until you can find it again. And so that's been a gift. So when my divorce happened, I was just done. I was done. And there's a scene in the book where I have to call the chair of the board and tell the chair of the board that I'm getting divorced. And I didn't know I was getting divorced, and it happened very surprisingly. And it was one of the moments when I found my faith again, because she said to me, you taught us how to be gospel community. We will now be gospel community for you and your children. And they did. Like, they made committees to protect my children. And they loved my faith back into reality. It was like church at its best, you know? And here I was living in the middle of like an institution that had killed my faith, but now was like blowing a little bit of air on those embers. And it's those experiences that keep me coming back to faith community, because it's what kills my faith and it's what helps me believe too. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Good morning. I certainly respect all that your place has gone through, and our hearts are with them. But it does bring to mind kind of a question. And I have to say, I haven't read your book. I'm just responding to your words and to what I see on your marquee there, which is an interesting thing. The idea of finding a way back to each other. I think there are many of us, myself included, who are not from a place, we're basically from any place, for whatever reason. Born and raised in the Navy myself, never stayed very long. And so my experiences of community are, as life progresses, finding a constellation of people or deal with, but it's transient and it moves on. And so the idea of a way back to each other seems a little problematic, just saying that. Also, the sense that somehow we can find a way out of uncertainty. I just see uncertainty as just a fact of life. And the only thing you can do is work it. Just work it, to use an analogy which I like. We try to build a string of pearls, but realize that in the middle of each pearl is a piece of shit. You know, an imperfection. So my question really to you is that what you really were conveying? I'm sorry, I'm responding. I hope that's not inappropriate. I apologize. So is that really the way you are phrasing your book in terms of a way back? I see it as a way forward.
Thank
Is
you.
that fair enough?
Thank you. Another argument with the publisher. I wanted the book to say doubt, faith, and discovering a way back to each other. And they wouldn't let me do it. They said, that's too negative. People are looking for faith. They're not looking for doubt. I'm like, I don't think that's right. I mean, you know, so I struggle with that as well. And as I said, I lose my faith several times in the book, find it again, find my way back. I'll summarize one of the stories in the book that you will read if you read the book. And this is going to touch a really tender place. I'm just telling you all that right now. It's a story about my friendship with a man named Todd Underwood, who is the founder of the United Gun Group, which is the largest online gun sales platform in the country. And he sold George Zimmerman's gun, the gun that was used to kill Trayvon Martin. And I mentioned him in a sermon once. It's a long story. You'll read it in the book. And he reached out to me. And we have hammered away a friendship of sorts. Enough that when he posts something terrible on Twitter, I can text him and say, take that down immediately. And he listens. And what is not in the book, and what will be in the next book if I dare to write another one, is a visit that I had with his family last year. I went to Kansas City and stayed with him and his wife and his 3 daughters. And they took me to a rifle range and taught me how to shoot a gun. And the feedback I got online from our crowd was really, really, really harsh. And the reason I went to Kansas City and the reason I went to the rifle range and the reason I keep a relationship with Todd is because it's the only way I know to try to find a way back to each other. And by that, I mean the kind of relationship where we can be in conversation about really, really hard things rather than cutting each other off and just going on with life. And that's why I wanted to include finding a way back to each other. It's stories and stories and stories of people in my life who have been lost to me and the work that I'm trying to do and they're trying to do to find our way back to each other. And bizarrely, this happens now to be a matter of serious national concern, isn't it? So probably the book will make you mad a little bit too. Thank you.
It's a quick question. How did you find your way to the UCC? I'm a retired UCC pastor, so I'm curious.
I'm a Baptist. Becoming a Baptist was my form of rebellion. My parents were are evangelical, very conservative evangelical Christians. They go to church next door, at the church next door to mine. My mom was really upset a few weeks ago because there were more cars in our parking lot than in theirs. They don't believe in women pastors, so, you know. I wandered into the UCC world when I became pastor of Riverside Church because I'm an American Baptist, I'm ordained American Baptist, and when I was called to Riverside Church, the UCC area minister reached out to me and he said, we'd like for you to apply for UCC ordination. You're gonna have to write a paper and you're gonna have to come in and be examined, and I was like, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. So I'm not actually a UCC minister, and I'm now pastoring a UCC church in Hawaii. In Hawaii, the largest Protestant denomination is UCC. And they're just like, come on in, everybody's welcome. So nobody's really talked to me about my Baptistness. And I have had to baptize a few babies. But I think there's grace for everybody. But that's how I wandered in, and I'm trying to stay on the sidelines because I hate denominational politics. How about you? It's the worst. They were good. That's wonderful. I actually think now is the moment for the UCC, because as the institution declines and churches are closing all over our country, 5,000 this year, this is why I started a nonprofit called Invested Faith, which is a fund that allows churches that are at the end of their life cycle to invest their assets in a fund that gives small, unrestricted grants to social entrepreneurs who are building businesses, who are creating community and healing the world, rather than have a developer take over your property, et cetera. But I think that churches like the UCC that cast a wide net of welcome, this is our moment. This is our moment to show the world what the church can be in our best expression.
Thank you. I'm just so inspired and touched by your story on so many different levels, but especially the title seems to be so evocative because you have "and," not beautiful but beautiful and. And so to me that it seems like you're maybe I haven't read the book of some sort of dialectic where at one end something is beautiful and at the other it's terrible. But based on what you're saying, it also seems like something can be beautiful and terrible at the same time. Am I with you there?
Every chapter, it's terrible and beautiful in every chapter. And it's interesting, when the church secretary, I asked her to read the book and do some editing for me around the Hawaiian words. And at the end she said, "Oh my gosh, you've been through so many terrible things. I'm so sorry." This from a woman whose son was a crack addict for 7 years and lived on the street. Like, we all have our terrible. Every single one of us has our terrible. And nobody's terrible is more terrible than anybody else's. And there's so much beautiful too. I'll just say, back to what you were saying, we just try so hard to make our lives look so shiny. And they're just not. They are just not. And what if church was a place where we could come and be like our real selves? I would like that a lot better than pretending and being shiny.
I don't think you have to worry about the reception for this book. The excerpt that you read was so lovely. It was funny, but it was heartwarming. And my question, you kind of already answered it. If you were the kind of evangelical conservative that you referenced, and your son went over and took this philosophy course and came back an atheist, you'd probably start a campaign to fire the philosophy professor. And my question, as a retired public school teacher myself, it's very tricky and hard to teach social studies, English, whatever, and be open-minded about it, try to model tolerance. And I think you've kind of answered the question, but a lot of public school teachers under attack now, and maybe the best thing is if these teachers had the resources to reach out to the people who are attacking them, like you reached out to the gunman.
It's not fun, though. It's not fun on every single level. It's not fun at all. I just remember sitting one night on the couch with Todd and his wife, Nicole, and her talking about how wrong abortion is. That wasn't why I was there. I was there to talk about guns with them. And there's part of the book that tells a story about a late-term abortion that I experienced. And I told her my story while we were sitting there on the couch. And she started crying and she said, well, I've never thought of it that way. And so sometimes I think our lives are the most powerful text we have to reach across a divide, if only it would just be real, right? It's dangerous, though.
Great, thank you very much. I have a question on the writing process. What takeaway did you have in your mind when you first started the book? And have there been any real surprises with the takeaways that the first readers and editors have actually had on what you wrote?
That's a good question. I wandered into the book writing business just by accident because I started a blog in 2005 called Talk with the Preacher, and I just wrote like little entries about my experiences as a mother, as a pastor, and then when I became pastor of Riverside Church, everybody was like, you should make this a book. It's going to be so great, right? I told you a little bit about the writing process, and there are things in the book that had you talked to me 6 years ago, I would not have thought that they would be in there. Some really, really hard personal things that required me to have some really difficult conversations with my parents published. So that is a surprise to me. One of the surprises that I had when I recorded the audiobook, the producer said, just pretend like this is the best writing you have ever read in your life. Like, don't critique it or anything like that. Do you know that I use the word coiffed in the book 4 times? Like, who even uses that word? Coiffed, you know? So I will forever, I think, be like, here's my book. I'm really sorry, you know? I'll do better next time. That's how I felt. The most redeeming part of the writing process was the end, when the editor and I went through every single sentence together and said, is this the exact word you want to use to convey what you're saying? And that was a beautiful process for me.
My husband was at Union, and so we lived in McGifford during James Forbes. We attended Riverside. Went back when you were pastor and walked into Riverside and were so disappointed because of the scaffolding, but enjoyed your sermon very much.
Thank you. Now you know the backstory of the scaffolding.
All right. Recently, I about ran out of people. So I came out to, find some more people and look at them. They're amazing. And this book is, it feels like it touches a lot of my experience, and it's going to help me out a lot as far as understanding people and how to deal with them and so forth. A couple of other small comments. My kid's sister happens to be an atheist, and we respect that. And the chapter you read was very touching. And then finally, about the botany there, my youngest stepdaughter is a field surveyor in Western Australia. She's collecting information for scientists studying the interaction between the annual wildfire season out there and the flora and we're going to have a nice conversation about this lava flower here.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for coming today and being so honest with your stories. But getting back to what happened in Maui or Lahaina, is there an organization people can contribute donations to that you trust and you know they do a good job?
Well, not to be self-promoting, but you can go on the website of Community Church of Honolulu, and so many people have asked me that we've begun a fund to help specifically the families of the learned as they get ready to go back to school and try to make something out of nothing. Other than that, I would say the YMCA is doing some amazing things right there in Lahaina, so I would feel really, really confident about saying, give your money to the YMCA of Maui. Yeah. Not the UCC, sorry.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm just so privileged to meet you. I am curious if Chaim has read your book. If your son, Chaim, is
Hayden.
Hayden, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
has read your book.
Yes.
And his reaction?
Yes. Well, see, when you're a pastor's kid, you know from very early in your life that whatever you do or say is fodder for any sermon. So it's interesting. My kids have read every iteration of the book. My daughter Hannah appears a lot in this book, by the way. And I think because the writing process took so long, they sort of put their anxiety to the side. But lately, especially with Hannah, she's been like wanting to know, tell me one more time, what did you say about Dad? You know, particularly about the divorce. And so that's been an interesting conversation. And again, that touches on my fear. Some of you know the poet Maggie Smith. You should have her here at Circular. She's so lovely. She just wrote a memoir of her divorce called You Can Make This Place Beautiful. I did not write about my divorce like that in any way, shape, or form, but she and I have talked a lot about the fear of putting your story out in front of people. And one thing I did not realize when it comes to my kids and my sisters too, I'm like taking a lot of their cover off while I tell my story as well, and I need to be sensitive to that. So I've been having a lot of hard conversations lately. Hard and good. That's a great question, thank you.
We probably have time for one more.
You're just amazing. I just love how you tear up when you're talking about this, so never try and hide that. Just have a tissue there.
Well, here's the thing, I cry in every single chapter. By the 6th chapter, I'm like, Amy, come on.
So my observation question is, when we dig deep into our faith, religion aside, we are helped to hold the terrible while still feeling joy at the beautiful. But sometimes when I'm very able to do that in the midst of terrible things, like hold that faith and say, you know, it will be, I'm trusting, you know, things will work out however way they work out. I almost find that other people expect me to be more like falling apart than I am, and I almost have to defend myself for being able to find that balance. How do you, have you felt that, and how do you deal with that?
No, because I cry all the time. I guess what I would say is, back to the question about finding our way back to each other, this is exactly why communities like Circular are so important, where you can come and hold your faith or lay it down or cry or be okay, and you have a group of people around you who say it's okay to have that space. So keep doing that for each other and keep asking for what you need. I think the weirdest thing about faith and church is that the church is not God, but in so many ways that's how we experience God. So be like God, you know? Okay. I didn't answer anything, but thank you everyone. Thank you so much for your
Can I ask one
research.
more question?
Sure.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to do that again in a minute. But you, just right now, like your face just radiates a lot of joy. And my question is, where are you finding joy these days?
It's a good question. So Jeremy will understand this. I left Hawaii 30 years ago to get away from my evangelical childhood and find my way, and I never wanted to come back. It's too far away. It's in the middle of the ocean. They're 20 years behind. Nobody, you know. And I have found, I went home for 1 year just to take care of my parents and get them all settled in their aging process. Wrong. That's not going to happen. So I'll be staying. But I feel so much joy in being in that land, in that air, around those people whose language and way of being I understand at my very core. Like, I feel like I'm home. And for 30 years, I've been trying to find it somewhere else. And so I have a rule that I go to the beach once a week at least, and I sit there. You guys probably do this too. And I look at the ocean and I remember how small I am, and then I take a deep breath and I keep going. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to let you all know, so hopefully you already know that we get to hear Amy again. She's our guest teacher today. And after the worship service, we'll have a book table where Amy will be signing book plates. So the books aren't out yet, but when you get yours, you can have a signed book plate to put in there. And then she's going to come back in here and do a little bit more of this, of sharing. So stick around for that. We have about 20 minutes before worship. Feel free to roam, and see you at 11.